Hello, welcome back to my channel. I'm Summit Sam, aka Low Gear, and today we're going to discuss post-hike budget. So what did I actually spend versus what I had planned to spend? I had done a pre-hike budget, obviously before for the hike. I did a lot of research into what I thought I would spend. I looked at a lot of these videos pre and post to see what actually was spent and what they thought they would spend. So this is my version of that, so I hope you enjoy it. If you're new here, thank you for joining the channel. Do give this a like and a subscribe, and let's get started. Okay, so what was my original plan? My original plan was I was going to save 10,000 American. Now I am Canadian, so that does translate into a little bit more Canadian, and that does all depend on the exchange rate of the day. The exchange rate for me wasn't that great, but it varied, every time I took out money and whatnot. So about, I would say 25 cents. I was paying about $1.18 to $1.25 for every dollar US that I got. So the exchange rate, not great, but that wasn't going to stop me. So I budgeted about 10,000 American. Now my trip originally was going to be about $3,000 for food, $3,000 for lodging, $1,500 for sort of the gear store. I thought I would spend a little less than that, and then plus I had about $1,500 for any stuff that I wasn't anticipating, things such as healthcare and whatnot, and whatever have you. So in total, I was roughly budgeting $10,000. And just to give it away right up front, that's pretty much what I spent. Now, how I spent it, very differently, but I actually did spend approximately $10,000. Now, I wasn't great in doing sort of Excel sheet type spending. I just don't do that. What I would do is I had my credit card, which was mostly for lodging, and then I would just take out a chunk of cash and spend that till it was done and repeat process. So I knew roughly what I had on me. Now some people wouldn't take that much cash. It worked well for us, particularly where we had Canadian banks. So when we had a place where we could get money out without spending a crap ton on fees, we would do that. So that's what we did. For those of you that are wondering what kind of banks translate, mostly we were a TD bank, so that worked well for us, especially in kind of the northern states. Wasn't so useful down in the southern states where they were a little harder to find, but you did have some banks that charged minimal processing fees. So when it came to food, did I spend about $3,000? Oh, I probably spent more, to be fair. Now the resupplies, especially up north, so New Hampshire, Maine, Connecticut, Vermont, I did find them more expensive. Actually, everything, quite frankly, in those states was more expensive than further south. Hostels, well, I'll get into that in a minute. But yeah, so resupply in the beginning was pretty pricey just because where you were resupplying tended to be the small towns or the actual places you were staying at. So the hostels that had that, like say for example Shaw, they have a great resupply, one of the better ones you'll find until you hit further south. So I always recommend resupplying there. You'll get all your goodies. Not cheap, but you'll get all the goodies. It was a great place to try some stuff we just don't get in Canada, or you didn't actually see along the trail. A lot of other places for resupply, you'll get things like the Walmarts and convenience stores. Dollar stores are definitely really, really big, I noticed. That's not something we're familiar with. We have dollar stores in Canada, obviously, but not to the level that Americans take dollar stores. So that was a bit of a surprise. But lots of good stuff, and all the stuff that you're going to take pretty much backpacking unless you've got a very specific diet. Now we didn't do resupply boxes. We didn't send ourselves stuff because, again, the international postage is kind of a pain, so we just didn't do that. That might work better for you. And we didn't buy a lot of the pre-made ready meals because they're also really expensive, and honestly what's in them and the ones that are any good tend to be the stuff that you can, like your ramen noodles, your mashed potatoes, your basics. So that was, it was pretty boring food, lots of granola bars, that type of thing. Where I spent the extra money, restaurants. Definitely when we got into town, I would load up in the restaurants, and I did, and your treats and all of that. So that's where extra money was probably spent, were the restaurants. Next, we have our lodgings. So lodging. So this I budgeted $3,000 for, and now Jeff and I, because there's two of us, obviously that's, I mean, we each budgeted $10,000. By the way, this is not 10 as a couple, because that just wouldn't work. Now some things were cheaper for us and some weren't. So in the end, that's roughly what we spent. But for hostels, roughly across the board, it was about $35. You could make that cheaper on occasion if you slept on the lawns of hostels, and that was available on sometimes. A few places, the hostels really weren't there, so you had bed and breakfasts. And that tended to be a little pricier because Jeff and I well, for the most part, there were very few places we actually did do the bunk beds. We would usually just get our private room, and that tended to be about, add the two together plus $10. So where you would have, usually a private bunk is about $80, or a private room is about $80. Sometimes that worked out really great. Sometimes that didn't. For example, when we were at the Roadhouse in New Hampshire, their bunkhouse is amazing. It's beautiful. It's huge. Each bunk has their own little fan, their own little electricity. It's great. Whereas the private rooms are quite small and a little on the stuffy side. So if we had realized that, we probably would have just flipped over. A lot of the hostels, okay, I won't say a lot, but a fair number of the hostels anyway, you can add in an extra breakfast or an extra meal or something, and their breakfasts, for the most part, are pretty worth it. Certainly the Roadhouse and Shaw's were great breakfasts and definitely worth the money, because going out to a restaurant, that's just going to be a lot more, unless you're doing sort of a roadside cafe thing, which some of those were really great breakfasts too. Plenty of places to get food for sure, obviously except the 100 Mile, because there's nothing there. So we did spend for lodging on hostels, private rooms, and that worked to be about the same. Now, where it made a huge difference for us, if you've been following my channel, you know that I did a supported hike from Vermont to the end, so Vermont to Georgia, because Jeff he wasn't satisfied with how the hostels and shuttle situation was happening and the wetness and everything. Anyway, long story short, he went back to Canada, grabbed our van, and we used our van as part of our sleeping system. So at that point, we spent several nights in our van as well from then on in. So that lowered accommodation costs, and it meant that if we did want to stay at hotels, we could travel to where we knew there was a cheaper hotel, not the ones right in those little towns. Because I did find if you're stuck in the towns closest to the trail, obviously things tend to be more expensive because they're capitalizing on that. And it's a business model. What can you do? That's usually just how it works. So we could drive a little further and go to the Motel 6 or Quality Inn or whatever was cheap at the time, and relatively clean, because we didn't really care that much. So we could do that. So that saved us a lot of money on lodging, where before we wouldn't have. Now you can definitely make that way, way cheaper and just not stay at hostels and hotels and just try to camp most of your time on trail. So that would make it way cheaper. But I enjoyed having the bed, especially when it was raining. I did find, again, the northern states, the hotels and hostels were cheaper. And sometimes you didn't have hostels, you only had hotels. And they're not cheap. My goodness, some of them are not cheap. So you cram a bunch of people in there as you can just to make it cheaper. And we did that, certainly. And, there's some times that we just stayed an extra night or two just because it was raining so hard and we just couldn't deal with it. In some other towns, like I think North Woodstock, New Hampshire, I want to say, we stayed at ski lodges because they had no income during the summer months, so they would open it up for the hikers, and that was another great place because it's like a hostel. And you had full kitchen access, and highly recommend those. I think we stayed at the Old Colony Inn Ski Lodge, I want to say. And that was a great place. I think we spent like 4 or 5 nights there. We did some slack packing. So some of those places will offer you free shuttles into the town and whatnot. So that can, make things a little cheaper. And again, you can cook your own meals. So you can go to the grocery store and cook food, and that makes it a lot cheaper. So there are definitely ways to reduce your cost. Next, gear. The gear stores. Oh, you can spend a lot of money in gear stores because every time you go to one, and especially some of these really well set up tourist towns along the trail have beautiful, beautiful gear stores. And you're like, ooh, I want some of that. But then you realize you got to carry it. And sometimes you're like, okay, now I realize that this piece of gear doesn't work. I did that with my rain gear. I started off with frog togs. They did not work at all for me. I squatted down and instantly ripped the crotch right open, and they were useless for the entire 100 mile. I tried to tape it up a bit, but honestly, they suck. I was gonna do the poncho thing, and I switched that out, and I'm so glad I did. The poncho I think might have worked in the summertime, but when we started in Katahdin, it was raining and snowing and icy and cold. It was just, the poncho was not happening. Jeff did try the poncho. It did not work for him. So I ended up switching out my rain pants for light heart gear, and I'm so glad I did. And then I ended up switching out my raincoat to something, I think it's a Marmot raincoat at a gear store, and I was very happy with that. So, I didn't know what I would need in the get-go, and I figured it out as I went along, so I switched those out. I also switched out my sleeping bag, which was way too heavy and way too warm. And I kind of had a feeling it would be, but I thought, I'll make it work. And then I realized that the weight wasn't worth it for me. Now I'm older, I'm smaller, I didn't want to carry that extra weight. I could afford it, so I did. If you couldn't or didn't want to, then there's no reason to. Certainly, don't freak out about base weight. I mean, lighter is nicer, not necessary, but nicer. So I ended up switching out my sleeping bag for a quilt, and I'm glad I did. I really like this quilt. I know I'll get a lot of use in the future for it, at least for the next trip that I'm planning in my head, and I'll give you deets on that one. I figure that all out. So I'm glad I did that, but it was not cheap. I also switched out my sleeping pad to something lighter. Was that necessary? Absolutely not. Do I regret it? Not necessarily, but I don't know. I really should have just stuck through it and kept what I had, because honestly what I had was probably better. And even now I think, was that a good choice? Probably not either. I would now choose something entirely different, but I don't want to spend more money, so I'm not going to do that, because hikers can spend a lot of money. And I switched out shorts, and I switched out my sun shirt because it was starting to fray. It was not a good choice for a hiking shirt. It was a good choice for a sun shirt, just not hiking. So, it's sometimes hard to know what kind of gear you're going to need until you're on the trail and using it, even if you do shakedown hikes, because long endurance versus a week here and there is not the same thing. So, don't freak out and go crazy when you need to first set up your gear. It's not going to be perfect. You'll figure it out as you go. Save your money for on the trail when you figure out exactly what you need. And who knows, you can save a couple bucks, because maybe at the end of the day you'll be like, I can manage. And probably you could. It's not really a big deal. So the gear budget definitely got blown. Shoes, I didn't go through as many as I thought I was going to. I did start off with the Hokas. That was not a good choice for me. They were not wide enough, even though I got the wide Hokas. I found the Ultras and the Topos, the much better choices. I did get a kind of a defected pair of Ultras, but Ultra stayed true to their word and they replaced them for me, so that was really great. My backpack was fidgety. I had a Z-Pax, but it worked great. I did have to get it fixed midway. If you watch my videos, you'll see all that, but I didn't replace it, and I kept everything that I had. The only issue I really had was trying to find a decent water bottle holder. I never did find one. That was a tough one. I would recommend Chicken Tramper if you're looking for one. I didn't have that. I don't even remember what brand I had, but it was never quite big enough. But I've seen a lot of and heard a lot of good reviews about the Chicken Tramper, so I'll be picking that one up next. Yeah, so the one thing that definitely I did not expect to be as expensive as it was. I mean, I knew they would be, but it definitely was one of the reasons why I ended up choosing a supported hike is the shuttles. The shuttles are all over the place. Partly because they're run independently by whomever is in the area. Sometimes they're run by the hostels. Um, so, you can really, really vary. I did find a lot of them to be really expensive. Now, gas price had gone up, but compared to Canada, gas was cheap. So when we brought our vehicle down, gas wasn't really that big of an issue. But for whatever reason, some of these shuttles were really, really expensive, and they didn't charge by the van load, they charged by the person. So Jeff and I would be hit double for that. And it just got to the point where it was just like, you know what? No, it didn't really work for us. Another place where we did spend extra money that most people wouldn't is we rented a car twice. First time to go back up to Katahdin to finish it because we didn't get to Katahdin the first time we tried, and we failed, so we had to go back to redo those miles. That because everyone needs to get to the top of Katahdin. That's kind of the point. You got to do that. So we had to rent a car to do that. I mean, we didn't have to, but we did, because it was just the only way for us to do it on our time frame. And then we had to rent a car to go back to Canada to grab our van so that we could continue the hike the way we wanted to. I do not regret having our van. I think it was a great choice for us. I definitely highly recommend a supported hike. It allowed us, again, to get cheaper food because we could put it in coolers. We could get cheaper accommodations because we could go a little further. And we slept in our van quite a bit as well, except for those really hot nights where just sleeping in a van there's no airflow in there, so you kind of need some AC. But there are other options. We slept in quite a few church basements by donation, so we threw them donations because they were so lovely to have. And we stayed at a few Airbnbs with friends, so costs were all pooled there. So there are definitely ways to make a through hike cheaper. So all said and done, though, my bank account that I had set aside, or this account that I had 10,000 US in it, and that's what I spent. I was very happy to have extra money when I came home, when we first got home, because we spent extra afterwards just relaxing, letting our bodies heal. We ended up taking a vacation to Cuba for 2 weeks to relax and sit on the beach. We're Canadian, so we can do that without having to worry as Americans do, which is a shame because it's a really lovely place to visit. But so we did that. And then, so since then, we're back nursing. So we've been working a lot there just to kind of rebuild up that money that we spent, but it was money well worth. So I highly recommend you save extra for your trip, or as much as you can. It can be done. I'm so glad I had that extra money to just not have to worry about, is this going to be enough? And thinking I'm going to have to go home early, or if I'm really wet and tired, going, oh, you know what? I want to be in a hotel. So we just took it. And so it's really just nice to know that you have those options available to you. All right. Well, thank you very much. I hope that helped. Again, give us a like, do subscribe so you can be notified as to my next journeys, which we will be planning some. I just haven't nailed down any details yet. So thank you very much. Thanks for watching.